Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to It Says What, where Limmud and JW3 come together to bring you unexpected and poignant Jewish content from across the Jewish community every week before Shabbat. I'm Joe Hyman, JW3's young programmer, and JW3 is the UK's Jewish Community and Art Centre. We're partnering to bring you this program with Limmud, a diverse and inclusive worldwide community of Jewish learning. Over lockdown, JW3 has been offering a wide variety of programs online, but it's exciting for me to tell you that from September, JW3 will be slowly reopening under government guidelines with some films, family activity, some live performances, and some events for 20s to 30s when we can. We're really excited about this, and we hope to see you all soon. What's also exciting is Limmud is having an incredible conference online, Limmud Together UK summer edition, where actually both our upcoming speaker today and myself will be running sessions. So please check that out on Limmud's website and book today. So this series will ask educators, artists, and leaders from across the Jewish community in the UK and abroad to share a surprising piece of Jewish wisdom for our time. You're able to ask your own questions on the text that we share, but please comment on our live feed, webinar, or on Facebook, and we'll feed them back to the rabbi today. I am delighted to welcome Rabbi Larry Tabick, Rabbi Emeritus of the Makor Chaim Synagogue, formerly Shir Chaim Reform Community, and lecturer in Kabbalah and Hasidism at the Leo Beck College. He is the author of Growing into Your Soul, a celebration of Jewish life, and the Aura of Torah, a Kabbalistic Hasidic commentary to the weekly readings. He holds degrees from the George Washington University and the University of Toronto, and received smicha from the Leo Beck College in 1976. He is the husband of Rabbi Jackie Tabick and the father of Rabbi Ronnie Tabick and of Jeremy Tabick, all of whom may be known to the Limmudniks amongst the crowd. So, welcome, Rabbi Larry. How are you?
As soon as I've unmuted, I will tell you that I'm fine. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, we're really glad to have you. Rabbi Tabick, tell us, what text made you say, it says what?
Well, this seemed like an invitation to present the weirdest text that I could possibly think of. And I had a couple of other options. When I shared them with my wife to get her opinion, she said, no, you have to do the Shior Koma. So this has got to be one of the strangest texts in all of Judaism. I taught this many years ago down in the Wimbledon Reform Synagogue, and really annoyed an elderly gentleman there who accused me of all kinds of heresies and things. But more about that in a minute. I'll explain what it is. Let me say a few words about the Shior Koma itself and what it is. So Shior Koma means the measure of the height, and it's quite a short text. There are 14 manuscripts of it. 13 of them have this versions of this text embedded in examples of what is called Hechalot or Merkava literature. Now, Hechalot, Merkava literature is Hechalot meaning palaces, Merkava meaning the chariot. These purport to be the the experiences of some of the great rabbis of the Mishnah, usually Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva, occasionally others, when they had experiences of seeing God's palaces or the chariot of God that's described in the opening chapters of the prophet Ezekiel. But it seems that the Shiur Kama exists independently of that, because what's probably the oldest version, the one that these little texts and translations have come from, is the only version, is the version where the Shiur Kama appears on its own. And the man who edited these, who's called Martin Samuel Cohen, reckons that this manuscript is probably the oldest. It's 10th or 11th century of the Common Era, and probably the closest to what must have been the original text, the original version. It's quite short. It's only 4 sides in the original. It's really quite insubstantial. And the text was known by the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the German Hasidim, in the 12th and 13th century, and it probably comes from Babylonia in the time of the Gaonim. It's not known in the Talmud, but it was known to Eliezer HaKalia, the rather obscure liturgical poet who lived in the 6th century, I beg your pardon, and Saadia Gaon, who lived in the 10th. The Rambam, Maimonides, thought this was absolutely awful. He thought this was a heretical text and that it should be burned. In his Mishneh Torah, he said, one of the 5 things that he says qualifies a person to be a heretic is one who says that God has a body or a form. And this is all about God's body. So he hated this. On the other hand, a famous commentator on his Mishneh Torah, the Ravad of Posker, said, why does he call such a person a heretic? Greater people than him have thought that God has a body. Well, okay, so I taught this source in Wimbledon, and an elderly gentleman got very angry because he said, we're taught Ein lo demut haguf, God has no body or the appearance of a body. How can you talk about God's body? And he said, and he quoted to me, famous passage from Exodus, of course, no one can see my face and live. And I had to explain to him, number one, that I'm not buying into this text. I'm not trying to tell him that God has a body. And number two, that even the text that he brought from Exodus to show that God has a body, God does not have a body, could be interpreted to say that God does. If you take that verse literally, it means God has a face. And the only problem is you can't see it and expect to survive. But there's a face, right? And the text goes on to say that Moses saw God's back. So, maybe there is a body there to see. And also the text, his reaction to the text, and most of our reactions to the text, show how much we are actually the children of Rambam. Because Rambam said, there's no way that God can have a body. So if we turn to the text itself, we have the text purports to come from Rabbi Ishmael, who lived in the 2nd century. There's no suggestion that this is really Rabbi Ishmael, but never mind, his name is attached to it. And he says, Rabbi Ishmael said, how much is the height of the body, the Shiur Koma of the Holy Blessed One who is hidden from all creatures? The parasangs of God's feet fill the entire world. Now, I can hear you thinking a parasang, but I've given myself and you a note. A normal parasang, this was a Persian measure, is about 4 miles. Though I have to say, in the Shiur Koma, they do define it as 3 miles. But anyway, so 4 miles. So the parasangs of God's feet fill the entire world, as it is said, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. So, and the height of God's souls is 30 million parasangs. And I worked that out at 4 miles per parasang. That's about 7.5 million miles, almost the distance to the sun, or 12 million plus kilometers. And the right, God's right soul is called Parasamia, Atrakat Shama, and the left Agomats. Now I have to say, regarding the names, now what the text does is it goes through various parts of God's body, and gives us the measurements and the names. And the names are what are known to academics as nomina barbara. In other words, nobody can work out what, if anything, they mean. They may just be random consonants. And by the way, the vowels that I've given them are purely conjectural. Nobody really knows. So, so the text proceeds through God's body and finally gives us a grand total. Thus, the total measure is 100 parasangs, or 10 billion parasangs wide. I'll let you work out, because it talks about myriads, but I'll let you work out the mathematics of that if you're so inclined. Around about the middle of the passage, the middle of the text, we're told that these measurements, which I've been trying to translate for you into miles and kilometers, or even light years, turn out to be actually quite a great deal bigger than even that. So we're told that just about the point at which you might be beginning to get a handle on how big these dimensions are, we're told that a parasang isn't 3 miles or 4 miles or whatever, 10 cubits, but each cubit is 2 of God's spans. That's the width of the hand from when the fingers are spread out from the thumb to the little finger. And one of God's spans fills the olam. Now, olam can mean the world or the universe, but even if it's the world, and the cubit is 10,000, sorry, cubit, there are 10,000 cubits, that one span, I mean, you can work it out. It means that the numbers that we already thought were quite large become totally astronomical when you start to apply this new definition of what a parasang is. And the other very odd thing that that we get, which I haven't shared with you on this sheet, is that at the very end, there's an intervention by Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva says that we should rehearse this passage every day in order to be assured of a place in the world to come, and rehearse it like a Mishnah. And in fact, the text opens with a passage that may be familiar to some of you, because it's the passage that opens the Pirkei Avot if you're studying it each Shabbat after the start of Pesach. And it begins, all Israel have a place in the world to come, as it is said, and so on. And you can find it in any prayer book version of the Pirkei Avot, because it's something that is supposed to be said before that. So at the end, when the suggestion is that one should read this every day, rehearse this every day, and that would assure us of a place in the world to come. You gotta admit, that's just weird. Or maybe you don't, I don't know, maybe you're into it.
I think it is weird. Just gonna confirm. I think that it definitely is quite odd. This text, and definitely one of the more unexpected texts to see kind of so much detail go into God's shoe size and hands and all these different things. And I think we're in a good situation when Maimonides is telling this text to be, calling for the text to be burned. I think it's quite exciting to be reading it together in 2020 in our current moment. What do you make of this text? Do you get meaning from this text in some way? For me, when God is mentioned in terms of a body, that tries to highlight this relationship that we have with God. And this doesn't feel like it's doing that. This feels like it's making God incredibly large. I wouldn't even be able to see God's foot because it was so large. So what are you getting from this text in terms of meaning, or is there no clear meaning that you're ascertaining?
I have to say that for me in my spiritual life, this text does not play a great part. I don't read it every day to assure myself a place in the world to come. I would like to think that criteria for the admission into the world to come has more to do with morality and ethics than it does with reciting a passage like this. But there is a view that says that, and this view is put forward by Martin Samuel Cohen, not in the book that this comes from, but in another book that he wrote on the Shir Kama. He makes the point that in his view, he thinks the whole thing is actually ironic. That he's making that the author is making these numbers so incredibly astronomical as to be beyond comprehension, and giving the parts of God's body these incredibly bizarre names in order to suggest to people who are into the notion of God having a body that this is a totally absurd concept. So if I were going to read it, for my own spirituality, it would be in that satirical vein. I have to say that the notion of God having a physical body is actually much more common than we imagine. In Rambam's time, in Maimonides' time, there was a man called Moshe Taku who wrote a book which is entirely about how we should take the statements in Torah and Tanakh about God's hand and God's arm and whatever, absolutely literally. Rambam was a bit of an outlier in his own time in this respect. Amongst the pietists, the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the German pietists of the 12th and 13th century that I mentioned earlier, they understood this text to be referring not to God as God is in God's essence, but to God as God might choose to appear to human beings, to the prophets and so forth. So they reconciled this notion in that way, these notions in that way. Later Kabbalists don't refer to the text directly, but they seem to take on its kind of message. And for them, the parts of God's body are not to be taken literally. They refer to God's attributes, God's powers and whatever, which they call the sfirot. But I don't want to go into the concept of the sfirot right now because that's a whole other thing. So this doesn't play much of a part in my spirituality. I can't get into it. It seems too weird even for me. And I'm delving into Kabbalistic stuff all the time, and God knows there's a lot of weird stuff in there, but this is just a weirdness too far.
Yeah, I think I can say that. I can say that too. But I like this idea of it being ironic, and it's interesting to me that Maimonides Rambam was so angry about this. I mean, if in the context it was seen as ironic, maybe he didn't read it sufficiently. Maybe he just saw it and kind of said, that's not dealing with that. It mentions God's body. I wanted to ask about the rest of this kind of short treatise about God's body, and ask if this idea is throughout the book. If this idea that we're gonna size up God's body and make it huge and overwhelmingly huge, or are there other things within this piece of writing that share different opinions or different thoughts that could add to this picture?
No, there's nothing else. This is not like all the Hechalot literature. This in a sense, this is just an example of that. The Hechalot literature doesn't engage in the kind of dialectic toing and froing of discussion that you get in traditional literature, in Talmud and Midrash and so forth. It's various rabbis, as I said, usually Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva, who simply present the result of their excursions in God's palaces or with God's chariot. They just present. There's no attempt to relate it to biblical verses, particularly. There is at the end of this, there's reference to Shir HaShirim, which suggests that there may be a connection with the real Rabbi Akiva, because we know the real Rabbi Akiva believed that that Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, was the Holy of Holies, was the most holy bit of the entire Tanakh. And it's possible that he understood, because remember, it's love song, it's love poetry. You have the male and the female lover, and it's possible that he understood the descriptions of the male lover in Shir HaShirim to be referring to God in more than just a metaphorical sense, but this is not some kind of midrash on the Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim, the bits that are mentioned at the end are only kind of dropped in. It's not a systematic exposition of Shir HaShirim, midrashic exposition of the Song of Songs. So these it's another way in which this text and other texts of which it is a part are outliers.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating, this text. We have one question from the audience, and interested to know if there's a parallel in Christianity with this particular figure, Dionysius the Areopagite. Yeah, who would say that the only meaningful way of speaking about God is through these completely absurd statements. Is there a relationship? Is there a kind of context this is coming into that was being discussed in other religions at the time as well?
I don't think there's any I'm not sure I have the information to answer that. I don't think there's any influence of any other faiths going on here. I think the criticism of it that emerged already in Saadia Gaon's time, that's in the 10th century, may have something to do with the influence of Islam, because the Karaites knew about this, and they said, well, this is what Rabbinic Judaism is about. It's about these absurdities about God's body, and that quite possibly would have been a Muslim view too. As for pseudo Dionysius, the Areopagite, I can't really comment on that. I mean, I've read that. in English, obviously, but it's not really, I'm not familiar with it enough to really comment on that. In a way, this is kind of heading in the same direction, but in a very different, from a very different approach. I mean, Dionysius is about the absurdity of making any statements about God at all. This is not really about that. This is simply about, or at least in the ironic reading of the text, it's about disavowing the physicality, the approach of physicality about it. But Rambam in some ways is closer, because Rambam is actually saying that there is no, that actually we can't really say anything positive about God. When we say God is wise, or God is mighty, or whatever, what we're really saying is God is not stupid, because our notion of wisdom is so dwarfed by whatever God's wisdom might be, that it's actually absurd to really use the same terms. So when we use those terms in our tradition, we're only allowed to, Rambam says, because it's the tradition.
And is there a way in which this text offers something different? If this text kind of sits in this space that says the size is so large, it's so overwhelming, and hence God isn't really understandable. Does this sit in a different space to the Maimonidean approach of, a negative theology of like God is not, God is not, God is not? Does this add something to actually just our personal experience of God, that we don't think of him as not something, but we think of him as something, but it's just so big? It's a really big hand. Does that add something that maybe Rambam doesn't add?
Not in the, I don't think it does in the form that we have it here. I think when you start to look at how Kabbalah from the 13th century onward starts to talk about God's hand and so on, when it starts to talk about, for example, God's right hand being chesed, loving kindness, and so on, then I think we're into realms where speaking of God's hand begins to, or God's body starts to feed into our own notions of how we can, as it were, act on God's behalf. Yes, so that if God's hands represent loving kindness and strength, then we can act with loving kindness and with inner strength in the world, and so on. I find that the formulation here doesn't do it for me. I mean, I think in some ways, if I were to derive any spiritual message directly from the text, as we have it, it would be a rather different one. A number of years ago, my eldest granddaughter, who was all of 3, Ronnie's daughter, went to Simchat Torah with her daddy. And of course, people are carrying the Torah around and dancing with it and so on, with the Sifrei Torah. And she said, God must be getting dizzy. And Ronnie said, why? And she said, because dancing round and round in the Torah, like the Torah is God and so on. And without going into what Kabbalistic interpretations one might apply to that, obviously my granddaughter didn't know and doesn't know anything about Kabbalah. But I think, for her at age 3, this was quite a reasonable thing for her to be concerned about. And I think for me, the message of the text is that we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss other people's ideas of God. See, Rambam, I once heard a lecture by an academic, Israeli academic, talking about the Zohar. And she said, one of the things about Kabbalah is that it accepts everything that went before. It reinterprets, but it accepts everything that went before. Rambam, on the other hand, rejects things that he thinks are inappropriate, like this text. And if there's a message here, for me, the message is, well, let's not be so quick to reject other people's understanding. It may be that that's the best they can do, or that's as far as they're able to go and at this stage of their life, or whatever. That in some ways the real proof of the pudding is not what they think about God. The real proof is how do they behave. What if they're religious? What ethical values do they bring to their life from that faith?
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful way to close today. Kind of thinking about taking the texts that sometimes don't immediately burst forth with meaning and understanding, and seeing them as a kind of product of an individual's experience or an individual's perspective at a particular time, and wondering what that individual, that person, took from it, and if we can learn something from it at this point in our lives. But I wanted to just say thank you, Rabbi Larry Tabick. It's been really wonderful learning with you and seeing such a quite random and unexpected text, as we always love to see. Thinking about God's shoe size kind of takes me back to Brent Cross and Clark's with one of those machines where you put your foot in. And I'm thinking, I'm not really sure that God could really ever get involved in that kind of scenario, but that's where it takes me, at least in my mind. But it's been so wonderful hearing from you. I want to just highlight to our audience once again that Limmud Together UK summer edition will be on Sunday. Please book, and also check out jw3.org.uk for our upcoming events. Just so you know, It Says What will be on hiatus next week while I take some much needed leave, and we'll be back the week after and continue through our reopening in September. So It Says What will not end when JW3 opens, but we'll continue this conversation of unexpected, obscure, and exciting texts from the Jewish tradition. So Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi Larry.
Shabbat Shalom.
And Shabbat Shalom to the audience. Thank you so much. Speak soon.